There's a dangerous myth they sell you about motherhood. They tell you that to love your children is to give everything, to pour yourself out until there's nothing left. For 81 years, I believed that was my sacred duty. I built this house, this life, on the foundation of my own disappearance. I thought my boundless availability was a gift, a constant, warm light they could always return to. But a light that's always on is eventually taken for granted. You just become part of the furniture. The hardest part wasn't the empty chairs at my dinner table on a Sunday afternoon. It was the slow, crushing realization that I had become an obligation they managed, not a place they longed to return to. I had loved them so completely, so selflessly, that I had taught them I didn't really exist as a person, only as a service. I promise you, there is a profound and painful truth in this that I had to learn far too late in life. Now, the silence in this house is a physical thing. It has weight. It settles in the corners of the rooms where my 4 children used to run, and it hums in the kitchen where I still, out of a stubborn and foolish habit, cook enough food for an army. The roast chicken sits on the counter, cooling under foil. In the refrigerator, there are containers of leftovers, meticulously labeled with their names: Michael, Sarah, David, Emily, as if that ink on the plastic lid could somehow summon them home. My days are a quiet ritual of waiting. I wait for a phone call that doesn't come. I find myself measuring the affection in their voices when they do call, hurried and distracted, just checking a box on their to-do list. I've become a predictable fixture in their busy lives, a reliable resource, but the woman who raised them, the one with her own thoughts and fading dreams, has become completely and utterly invisible. My days are built on the ghosts of habit. I wake up when the house is still blue with pre-dawn light, and the first thing I hear is the hum of the old refrigerator. It's a sound that used to be a comforting backdrop to the chaos of children getting ready for school, but now it's the loudest thing in my life. I walk through the living room, my fingers tracing the dust on the piano keys that no one plays anymore. On the mantelpiece, there are photographs of 4 smiling children who grew into 4 busy adults. I look at their faces, frozen in time, and feel a pang of something I can only describe as a beautiful, distant ache. In the kitchen, I still make a full pot of coffee, the aroma filling rooms that will remain empty. It's a ritual of hope, I suppose, a foolish belief that a familiar smell might just pull them back home. I sit at the large oak table in my usual chair, and I drink my 1 cup, watching the sun slowly illuminate a life that feels like it's waiting for its real occupants to return. The relationships I have now are conducted through a telephone line, thin and fragile. When one of my children calls, usually while driving or in between meetings, their voice is a hurried echo from a world I no longer belong to. They ask the same question, "Everything okay, Mom?" But it's not a question that's looking for a real answer. It's a password to end the conversation with a clear conscience. I've learned not to talk about the leak in the guest bathroom or the loneliness that sometimes feels heavy as a winter coat. My life has been edited down to a simple, convenient summary. I'm fine. I find myself measuring their love in the seconds before they say, "Well, I've got to run." It's a terrible kind of emotional math. I give them the one thing I have left to offer, my complete lack of needs, because I'm terrified that if I were to ask for anything, for just a little more of their time, they might not call at all. And the thought of that silence is worse than the hollow conversations we have. It happened on a Sunday, the 3rd Sunday in October to be exact. The air was crisp, and the leaves outside the kitchen window were a blaze of orange and red. I had spent the entire morning in a familiar, almost sacred ritual. The scent of rosemary and garlic from the roasting chicken filled the house, a smell that for 50 years had meant family, laughter, and a full table. I mashed the potatoes until they were creamy, exactly the way David likes them, and made sure the gravy was lump-free. A small detail Sarah always appreciated. I even baked an apple pie, Emily's favorite. Every action was an act of love, a prayer whispered into the ingredients. I set the table for 5 with the good china and the cloth napkins. Looking at it, all polished and waiting, a foolish, stubborn hope flickered in my chest. This time, I thought, this time they'll come. It was a lie I had told myself 1,000 times before, but it was the only thing that kept me moving. The clock on the wall ticked, each second landing with a thud in the cavernous silence. 2 o'clock became 3, and 3 bled into 4. The beautiful roast chicken, its skin perfectly golden, was now cooling on the counter, its warmth slowly surrendering to the room. One by one, the texts came in, little digital daggers of apology. Michael was stuck in traffic an hour away. Sarah's youngest had a sudden fever. David had a last-minute work crisis he couldn't avoid. Emily, my youngest, simply said something had come up. The excuses were different, but the message was the same. They weren't coming. I didn't reply. I just sat at the head of the perfectly set table, looking at the empty chairs, each one a monument to a love that had become inconvenient. The sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the dining room floor, and the food I had made with so much care became just another cold meal in a quiet house. And then it happened, not with a crash or a scream, but in the devastating quiet. I was staring at the plate I had set for myself, the food untouched, when the thought landed. It wasn't a new thought, but this time it arrived with the force of a physical blow, so clear and so final that it took my breath away. I taught them this. The words echoed in the empty room. I had trained them, with decades of unwavering availability and selfless giving, to see me as a constant, a resource that would always be there, no matter what. I had taught them that my time had no value, that my efforts required no reciprocity. I had so successfully erased my own needs that they had learned not to see them at all. It wasn't their fault. It was my own creation. My greatest virtue, my boundless, unconditional love, was the architect of my profound loneliness. In my desperate attempt to be the perfect mother, I had made myself perfectly invisible. The pain of that realization was so sharp, so absolute, that it felt like it should have broken me. But it didn't. Instead, something else rose in its place, a strange, cold, and unfamiliar calm. The frantic hope that had lived in my chest for years simply dissolved. There were no tears. The time for tears was long past. I stood up from the table, my movements slow and deliberate, like someone waking from a long, troubled sleep. I walked to the hallway, to the little alcove where the old, heavy, black telephone sat on its wooden table. It had been there for 60 years, a lifeline to the outside world, a symbol of my constant availability. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the cord, and with a quiet little pop I pulled the plug from the wall. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of waiting anymore. It was the silence of a choice being made. For the first time in my life, I was unreachable, and I had no idea what would happen next. The first 24 hours were the hardest. The silence in the house wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a living, breathing thing that pressed in on me from all sides. Every time I walked past the hallway table, my eyes would fix on the disconnected phone cord, lying on the floor like a dead snake. A part of me, the part that had been a mother for over 50 years, screamed in protest. It felt like a betrayal, a selfish, childish act. What if there was an emergency? What if one of them needed me? The thought sent a jolt of pure panic through my chest, a physical ache that was almost unbearable. I paced the floors of my own home like a caged animal, wrestling with the ghost of my old self. This deep, instinctual need to be available was a current that had run through me my entire adult life, and I was now trying to swim against it. The sheer effort of not plugging that phone back in was the most difficult thing I had ever done. It was the sound of my old identity starting to die, and it was a violent, terrifying process. As the days bled into one another, the panic began to subside, replaced by a hollow, echoing loneliness that felt different from before. Before, my loneliness was about waiting. Now, it was about a choice I had made. I would catch myself stopping in the middle of a task, listening for a car in the driveway that I knew wouldn't be coming. I would open the refrigerator, see the empty shelves where their labeled containers used to be, and feel a profound sense of loss, not for the food, but for the ritual. I had spent a lifetime anticipating their needs, solving their problems, being the constant, reliable center of their universe. I remembered one winter when Michael's car broke down 2 hours away in the middle of the night. I was the one he called. I got in my car without a second thought. Who would he call now? This question haunted me. In my attempt to reclaim myself, was I simply abandoning them? The fear that I had gotten it all wrong, that I was trading one kind of pain for another, was a constant, unwelcome companion in the quiet rooms of my house. Then, on the fourth morning, something shifted. I woke up not to the usual knot of anxiety in my stomach, but to the gentle sound of rain against the window pane. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and stopped, my hand hovering over the large pot. For whom? The question hung in the air, but this time it didn't feel heavy with loss. It felt simple. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, There were no expectations, not even my own. I reached into the cupboard and took out a small, single-serving French press I hadn't used in years. I carefully measured out the coffee, just enough for one. As I waited for the water to boil, I looked out the window. The rain was washing the autumn leaves clean, making their colors brighter. I wasn't thinking about who might call, or who might need me, or what I should be cooking for Sunday. I was just watching the rain. The silence in the house was no longer a roaring void. It was becoming something else. It was becoming clean. And in that clean, quiet space, I felt the first fragile stirring of something that felt almost like peace. It was the 7th day, a full week since I had unplugged myself from the world I had so carefully built. The raw panic had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a stillness that was both vast and unnerving. I found myself standing at the back door, looking out at the small patch of earth that used to be my vegetable garden. For years, it had overflowed with zucchini and cucumbers, and more tomatoes than we could ever eat. I grew them for my children, for the sauces I would can, and the salads I would make for those big Sunday dinners. Now, it was just a square of dry, cracked dirt, overgrown with weeds. It looked exactly how I felt inside, neglected, fallow, its purpose long since fulfilled and forgotten. I had spent so much of my life cultivating things for other people that I had completely forgotten how to tend to my own soil. I had let myself go to seed, and now, standing there, I saw the stark, undeniable evidence of my own neglect. The garden wasn't just a patch of land, it was a mirror. I walked to the old shed at the edge of the yard, the door groaning on its rusty hinges. Inside, it smelled of earth and time. Tucked away in a cobwebbed corner, inside a dusty tin box, I found them, a small faded paper packet of tomato seeds. I hadn't bought them, they had been my father's from the year before he passed. I remember him pressing the packet into my hand, his own hands rough with soil. "You have to plant something for yourself, Diane," he'd said. "Not for a husband, not for the children, just for you, to watch something grow." I was a young mother then, and I didn't understand. My whole world was about growing things for others. But now, at 81, holding that fragile paper packet, his words came back to me with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't about a garden. It was about a promise I had failed to keep to myself. I took the seeds, and for the first time in a very long time, I made a decision that had nothing to do with anyone else. I was going to plant a garden, just for me. Kneeling in the dirt, the sun warm on my back, was like a prayer. My fingers, wrinkled and stiff, worked the soil, pulling the stubborn weeds, preparing the ground. With each weed I pulled, it felt like I was clearing away a piece of an old, painful story. As I gently pushed each tiny seed into the earth, the most profound realization of my life settled over me. All those years, I thought my love was a grand, selfless act. But it wasn't. It was a performance. I was cooking, cleaning, and giving as a way of shouting into the void, "Look at me, see how much I love you, please, love me back." My love was loud and desperate and demanding. This was different. This quiet act of planting a seed, with no audience and no guarantee of a harvest, was an act of pure, unconditional faith. Not in them, but in myself. It was the understanding that you cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot offer fruit from a barren tree. I had been trying to do both for decades. Self-love, I finally understood, wasn't selfishness. It was the necessary, sacred work of tending your own garden. I patted the last of the soil into place and slowly got to my feet, my knees aching. I looked at the small, neat row of freshly planted seeds. The house stood behind me, silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the oppressive, heavy silence of absence. It was the clean, quiet, patient silence of a field that has just been sown. It was potential. It was peace. The house was no longer a monument to a family that had outgrown it. It was simply my home, a place where I lived, a place where things could still grow. The crushing weight of waiting for a phone to ring, for a car to pull into the driveway, was gone. It had been replaced by a different kind of waiting. The gentle, hopeful anticipation of watching a tiny green shoot push its way through the dark soil toward the sun. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I was waiting for my tomatoes. And in that simple, profound shift, I felt the first true moment of my own, unborrowed life begin. My days began to change, not with a grand gesture, but with a series of small, quiet revolutions. I started cooking for an audience of one. Instead of a family-sized roast, I'd poach a single piece of salmon with lemon and herbs, arranging it on the good china just for myself. I ate by the window, not the dining table, watching the world outside instead of an empty chair. The house, once a stage for a play that was no longer running, slowly became my sanctuary. I rearranged the furniture, moving my favorite armchair into the patch of sunlight that streamed into the living room in the afternoons. I filled the silent rooms with music my husband had never liked, old jazz records that made me want to dance. Each small act was a reclamation. I wasn't erasing the memories of my family, I was simply making space for my own life to exist alongside them. The silence was no longer a void to be feared, but a peaceful space that I was learning to furnish with my own presence, my own joy. I began to understand love in a way I never had before. For most of my life, I believed love was a form of labor. It was something you did, something you gave, a constant outpouring of energy in the hopes of receiving something back. My love was loud, needy, and exhausting. I see now that it was built on a foundation of fear, the fear of being alone, the fear of being forgotten. I was so busy performing motherhood that I never learned how to simply be. The quiet of these days has taught me that real love isn't a transaction. It's not about keeping score or measuring affection in the length of a phone call. It is a quiet, steady state of being. It's the peace I feel tending to my tomato seedlings, the contentment of reading a book in a silent house. It must first exist within yourself. You cannot give away what you do not possess. I don't blame my children for not seeing me. I had spent a lifetime teaching them I wasn't there. My anger has dissolved, replaced by a deep, quiet compassion for the woman I used to be. This newfound peace started to seep into everything. I reconnected with the woman I was before I became a wife and a mother. I found my old watercolor set in a dusty box in the attic, the paints all dry and cracked. I bought new ones. I'm not a great artist, but that isn't the point. I spend hours painting the birds in my garden, the changing light on the trees, losing myself completely in the color and the paper. I'm not painting for an audience or for praise. I am painting because it makes me feel alive. The phone in the hallway is still unplugged, but it no longer feels like a weapon or a shield. It's just an object. Its power over me is gone. I've come to realize that my worth is not determined by my usefulness to others. It is inherent. It is the simple, profound fact of my own existence. I am not waiting for my children to give me a life. I am building one for myself, right here, in the rich, fertile soil of my own solitude. The phone is still unplugged. Some days, I forget it's even there. My children haven't come. I don't know if they've tried to call, if they've wondered where I am. A part of me, the old me, might have seen that as the ultimate tragedy, but the woman I am now understands it as a necessary silence. I've learned that love cannot be forced, and it should never, ever cost you your self-respect. Real love doesn't need to be chased. It meets you where you are, and you must first be somewhere worth finding. For the first time in decades, my house feels like mine. My days belong to me, and the deep, quiet peace I found not by getting something I wanted, but by letting go of what was breaking me, is worth more than any crowded Sunday dinner ever was. I am no longer a service. I am a person, and my own company is, it turns out, a beautiful thing to keep. So I ask you, from the vantage point of 81 years, do not wait for the silence to become unbearable before you learn to listen to yourself. Do not build a life so completely for others that you forget to leave a room for your own soul. They tell you that true love requires you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, but that is a dangerous and beautiful lie. A fire that consumes itself leaves nothing but ashes, and ashes cannot comfort anyone. Your life is not a resource to be depleted. It is a garden to be tended. Plant something for yourself. Water it. Watch it grow. Because the greatest gift you can give to the people you love is not your eternal availability, but the example of a life lived with dignity, a life that is whole and complete, all on its own. Your wholeness is the only true home you will ever have.